Hello and welcome to Personable, a podcast focused on speaking to the world's best, enabling you to become the best that you can be. My name is HarveyBracken-Smith, and today I'm going to be joined for the second time by Ismail Radwan. Ismail is the lead economist for the World Bank with an emphasis on GCC from Washington. He's the former senior director for economics and investment strategy in the Saudi Arabia Public Investment Fund, the PIF. He's a former lead economist at the World Bank, having worked there for 22 years, so he's back. And he's also a graduate from Oxford and UPenn. Ismail, I'm very excited to have you back today. Thank you very much for agreeing to come back. I wanted to get started by asking you to explain the role that you're in now and why you decided to come back to Washington from Saudi Arabia.
It was great to be with you, Harvey, and thank you very much again for the invitation. I always enjoy these conversations with you. And thank you for the introduction, a very accurate one indeed. So you've captured lots of different incarnations that I've had in the last few years. So right now I am a lead economist for the Middle East and North Africa. We've also recently added Afghanistan and Pakistan. So we used to be MENAP and now we're MENAP. So we've increased the size of our remit and scope. The role that I'm in now is basically, I'm still focusing on the GCC countries, and the World Bank is involved in a number of different areas, providing technical assistance to these countries. I'm in something called the Prosperity Team, and that includes people looking at macroeconomics, people looking at governance, institutions, anti-corruption, judicial reform processes, people looking at the private sector, financial sector, innovation, growth. One of the key themes that the World Bank is working on now is the jobs and growth agenda. So the idea is the reason that probably everybody listening to this podcast is not poor because they have a job. If you have a job, you can actually buy all the other inputs that you need. You can pay for your education, your healthcare, etc., etc. So having a job not only gives you the income, it gives you the purpose in your life. So if we are able to provide jobs for everybody, we would be able to eradicate poverty around the globe. And so that's now the main focus. It was always an important part of what the World Bank did, but we had other groups that were looking at health, looking at education, looking at agriculture, looking at infrastructure. Those things are all still important, but with the idea that they all have to create jobs at the end of the day. So I think, yeah, go on.
I feel like for countries like Saudi Arabia, which are more established and you've got a better relationship with the government, I feel like it's like the UK or the US, it's a lot easier to be able to get the jobs information and the right information you need for your job. But with a country like Afghanistan, for example, how do you go about getting the necessary information that you need to do your job well?
Okay, so you mean as an Afghan, how would you be able to...
No, I mean for the World Bank to be able to get...
From the World Bank perspective? Yeah, so that's absolutely a great question. So you've hit on one of the issues in terms of we want all of our policies to be evidence-based. So we can't just make up, policies at our whim, although some countries seem to do that. I'm not mentioning any names. And in countries like Afghanistan, it is difficult. So all of these countries do have statistical bureaus and they do collect statistical indicators. So one of the things that they do is a household income and expenditure survey. And they will go out to a representative sample and they'll ask people, what have you been spending your money on in the past month? And people will write down, keep a diary for a month-long process, how much they spend on rent, going out, on their groceries, etc., etc. And then that information will be sent back and compiled by the Central Statistical Bureau. It used to be done by hand, now it's usually done electronically, people with iPads visiting households, etc. And we do the same for the business sector. So there's something called the Establishment Survey, and we'll go out and we'll try and get a handle on the number of businesses, how many employees they have, what their turnover is, etc., etc. And all of those statistics are then compiled by the statistical office and they're presented in a bulletin. Sometimes some of the statistics are updated monthly, sometimes quarterly, sometimes annually. Sometimes we do some of these surveys with them every couple of years. So this is something that the statistical organizations do in the national arena and something that the World Bank helps. But even in Saudi Arabia, we were doing a lot of help with the statistical office in Saudi Arabia, trying to look at, for instance, inflation numbers. if you want to measure inflation, what you have to have is a consumption basket. So you need to know what people are spending their money on, and that basket changes over time. So if you're trying to measure what people are spending their money on now, in Saudi Arabia, for instance, people are going out to concerts, they're going out to cinema. These things didn't exist 5 or 6 years ago. There was no cinema, there was no concerts, no music, etc., etc. So you need to think about what people are spending money on and how that changes over time, the structure of the consumption basket. So that's something that we do struggle with, and it's more challenging in countries like Afghanistan and Pakistan. And it's something also that even in very advanced countries, they do all of these surveys, they publish their flash estimates, and then after a while they look back on the estimates and new data comes available, and then they refine them and revise them. And I think the UK had a big revision in terms of the employment numbers about 18 months ago. So this is an art, it's not a science, and we're always trying to get the best numbers that we can to be able to put the right policies in place.
You mentioned very importantly that jobs are a very important thing. I've said important twice there. In terms of, people have work that they can go and earn money, it reduces global poverty, which is a very important thing to do. But in the last 2 to 3 years, there's kind of been this thing which is not only wiping out low-income jobs, but also entry-level, high-income jobs, AI. How has that impacted your work at the World Bank?
Okay, so this is a new area, and we don't have the answers. I don't think anybody has the answers. A lot of people are starting to think about the impacts of AI, and I think it's still too early to tell. So there are obviously a lot of people who are incredibly bullish on AI, and you can see that in the stock markets. I mean, I don't have to tell you, the Nvidia has become the number one in the world, and I think it's worth something like $5 trillion. It's added $1 trillion in just the last few months. So these are like mind-boggling figures, quite honestly. And I don't think it's sustainable. So there are people who, I've been in the markets for more than 30 years. I remember the dot-com bubble and crash. It was very much the same idea. There was this idea that this time it's different. The internet is going to add so much value that all of these companies are going to be fantastic winners. And this is what we're hearing about AI. Potential for AI is just sky high, and all of these companies are going to come through. But when you think about it, ChatGPT, if you need a subscription, it's what, $20-30 a month. Is that going to cover the trillions of dollars they've put in the investments on the chips? No, it's not. There are going to be winners and losers, and I think there are going to be a lot of people who are disappointed. We're starting to see this week, I think maybe the last 2 weeks, a little bit of a pullback. We had the S&P 500 hitting a high, gold hitting a high. There's a lot of bullish sentiment still out there, despite all the uncertainty. But I think if we're a little bit more reasonable, we'll realize, yes, AI will have an impact. And yes, there will be some things that we're not doing anymore or we're doing differently, but it's not going to wipe out entire economies. So we still need, AI doesn't work on its own, at least for now. We still need people who know AI as a tool and are able to use AI. For instance, people say AI is great at coding, but if you don't know any coding, you still can't use AI to code, right? And, the same for economics. You can ask AI all sorts of economic topics, and for the most part, it'll give you good answers. But if you know nothing about economics, you don't know enough to know when it doesn't have the right answer or what's relevant and irrelevant. So I think it's a great tool. It will make people more efficient, but it's not going to replace a lot of people in a very short space of time.
I had a conversation with a podcast guest yesterday with regard to AI, and he kind of had a different view. I'm more in your boat, but he had a different view in which he was kind of saying that AI is going to kind of, maybe both can be true. He was saying that AI is going to impact social media a lot, and he works in social media, and so he's going to change this, it's going to change this, and so he's saying it's hard to plan ahead. But a really good point that he gave me is he was like, focus on what's not going to change. So for example, when Jeff Bezos made Amazon, he thought, instead of thinking, no one can predict what's going to happen in the future, but what's not going to change? What's not going to change is that customers are going to want cheaper prices and fast delivery. And so with that same concept, with the work that you're doing at the World Bank, with AI, with all the other important big things going on, with the potential for a pullback in the market, what are some things that are not going to change in the next 5 to 10 years that you can focus your work on in the countries that you work in?
Okay, so I think certainly in the next 5 years, we're still going to have people who need help in the countries that we're working in, people in Afghanistan and Pakistan, but also people in the GCC who need help with technical things. So there will I think there will still be the need to have the best regulations possible to empower entrepreneurs to start businesses. People are going to need access to finance. People are going to need access to healthcare, access to education. I don't think that just because we have this AI that people will stop going to school, stop learning. People will still need operations, they'll still need to go to hospitals, even if some of the diagnostics are helped by AI systems. So we're still going to need all of those things that we work on in the World Bank. People are still going to need a lot of infrastructure, good infrastructure, especially energy, and we're still going to have to continue with the energy transition to move away from fossil fuels to renewables. So all of that transition, I think all of that investment, if anything, we're going to need more because of the huge need for the data centers that are coming in. We're going to have to invest more on electricity and make sure that it's sustainable. So I think we're pretty confident that we'll still be in business in 5 years' time for all of those reasons.
I find it fascinating in the work that you do because with regard to your goal at the World Bank, no matter who, any human has their own biases and has their own things that they think should be done. You might think something should be done and I think something should be done, but then the World Bank has its own values, and then all of the different countries that you work with have their own values. They might have a regime change, so that's going to change the direction. How do you balance your personal beliefs with the core mission of the World Bank, with the missions of the countries that you work with?
Okay, so this is a very tricky question, Harvey. Very good question, as usual. So I think the World Bank has its own values, and so, and they're probably universal values, integrity, respect, all of those things. And we have our mission statement, which is trying to produce a world that's free of poverty. And we're also focused on what we call the twin goals. One is poverty eradication. The other one is equitable distribution for the bottom 40%. On a sustainable planet. So those are the kind of the twin goals, plus needing to do it on a sustainable basis. I think pretty much everybody can agree that those are good things. Now, there are some values in some countries that don't always match the World Bank's values. So we also have values, for instance, for tolerance, we try not to discriminate based on race, gender, sexual orientation, etc., etc. Not all countries sign up for those kind of values. So we still work with all of these countries that maybe don't share all of our values. In many of them, we try and take on an advocacy role. We try and explain why these are important for them, why these values will end up with better outcomes. I'm a great believer in the importance of values and the importance of getting the values in sync with your development profile and trajectory. If you think of, Easter Island?
Yes.
Okay, so Easter Island, I think, is a fantastic example of this. So you have these big statues. They're massive, right? So we thought they were just heads. But then when we dug under the ground, we found that they were actually the head and the whole body was there. But only a little bit of the head was above the ground, right? So these are massive, massive structures. Now, this was a civilization that basically everybody wanted the biggest, right? So just like now, everyone wants the biggest tower. The Burj Khalifa is the biggest tower in the UAE, so Saudi's building the Jeddah Tower is going to be bigger. Kuwait wants to build the Silk City Towers. Everyone wants the biggest. It was the same on Easter Island. To carve out these statues took a lot of energy and time and resources. So, at least with these big skyscrapers, people can live in them and use them. These other things were just vanity projects, basically. To move them around the island, these were massive structures. What they had to do is cut all the trees down and use them as rollers. So they would roll these massive statues from the quarry to wherever they were going to be displayed. And after a while, they built so many of them, they cut down so many trees that they ended up with no trees. Once they had no trees, they had no canoes, they couldn't go fishing anymore. Birds and different wildlife that used to come to the island no longer came to the island. They ran out of resources quite quickly, and it ended up with kind of a civil war of all against all and cannibalism. And I think one of the historians says that one of the common insults in those days was your mother's flesh sticks between my teeth. So that gives you an idea of, if you have the wrong values, you can end up in a very poor development outcome. And I think it's the same nowadays. If we're not tolerant, if we have systems that promote nationalism, that promote hatred against other groups, etc., we'll find that our societies will disintegrate from the inside. I think this is the danger that we're facing now with this kind of rising populism and nationalism in many countries around the world.
I think that when I was young, and I'd have a disagreement with my siblings or my parents or even a friend, there's kind of this belief that, if, screw them, I'm not going to talk to them, I'm better than them, I have a different value set to them, we're better off apart. But as I've got older, I've realised that even if we disagree on some really big things, having that ability to openly communicate, even if we disagree on 99% of things, we can still share groceries, we can still share a home. There are things that enable you to still connect with each other. And I think that draws some similarities between that and the work you do with the World Bank, because someone might say, well, the goals of the World Bank don't align with XYZ country. And it's like, yes, but we would rather have some relationship with this country, respect their traditions and respect their values, but at least we can help some of the people in that country, versus if we said, screw you, we're not going to work with you, we wouldn't be able to help them at all. And so it's kind of like the lesser of the two evils sort of situation.
Yeah, no, 100%, Harvey. It's only sick people that need a doctor, right? So if you don't have any challenges, you don't need the World Bank. We pride ourselves on having a board where almost all the countries in the world are represented. And we've had times where countries are even at war with each other, don't have diplomatic ties, but still each of them has a representative on the board of the World Bank, and they can still dialogue and talk to each other at the same time. So I think we had this debate within the World Bank: should we get involved, should we not get involved in some of these tricky situations, in conflict situations? And I think now the pendulum is swinging to your way. Yes, let's get involved in a dialogue. Doesn't mean we support, doesn't mean we take sides, but at least we have a dialogue, at least we can understand what the situation is. I think that's absolutely important. Human beings, we're the only animals that have this complex communication system, and that's what's allowed us to dominate the planet and to do all of the things that human beings have done. So communication is absolutely the key. I'm a great believer in communication. You are what you communicate. It doesn't matter, you may have the best strategy in the world, the best intention in the world, but if you can't communicate it, if you can't express it in a way that's attractive to other people and speaks to them, then your strategy or whatever you want to do is not going anywhere. So I think that's super important.
I like that phrase, you are what you communicate. I'm gonna steal that one. You're gonna hear me in like 5 podcasts and I forgot I heard it from you. And I'll be like, oh, that was so profound. Be like, yeah, it was Ismail said that to me. So you had working in Saudi Arabia, obviously you had a strong focus with please correct me if I'm wrong, I'm sure it would have been a Saudi Arabia first approach because you're working with Saudi Arabia. How has that changed in your mindset, how you get your information, how you learn, how you focus on things, versus just focusing on Saudi Arabia versus having to focus on all these countries now? Has it changed much of your day-to-day job role, how you think about things?
Well, let me first say that it wasn't that difficult because, certainly nobody in Saudi said Saudi first. I never heard that in Saudi Arabia. But what I did hear a lot was, in fact, the importance of Saudi Arabia's role in maintaining excellent relationships with all sorts of different partners. So today, His Royal Highness Mohammed bin Salman is here in Washington, D.C., meeting with Donald Trump. So this is an auspicious day. And the Saudis have had excellent relationships with the Americans, from a long, long time ago, from the days when the Saudi state was founded. But at the same time, the Saudis also had excellent relationships with the Chinese. Xi Jinping came to Riyadh, and his ministers would come often to the PIF and to other ministries to discuss deals, co-investment deals, etc. So China obviously imports a lot of oil from Saudi Arabia. So I think the biggest customer for Saudi oil. So they wanted to keep a good relationship there. They also reached out to the Iranians to try and diffuse some of the tension between Saudi and Iran. They've supported many of the countries around after closing the rift with Qatar. They also invited Syria back into the Arab League. And so they've really played this role as being the kind of the grown-up in the room, trying exactly what you say, trying to maintain the dialogue, still talking behind the scenes with Israel, still supporting Egypt, supporting Pakistan, Turkey with a lot of investments. So I think it's not that difficult to move from that situation to a situation now where I'm in the World Bank, where we're actively trying to do, let's say, poverty alleviation first, rather than, one country first. And we're trying to, improve trade in an environment where tariff barriers are going up, trade is being questioned by several countries, economic development linkages also being questioned. So I think there's more continuity than you can imagine, and I think it's been a fairly easy transition for me.
Just to clarify, sometimes you say something. It's just going back to your what you say. Just to clarify, I wasn't saying like I know there's that political term like America first. I wasn't thinking like that. I was more thinking like if I live and work in the UK, my focus is going to be on the surroundings, just because that's the region I'm in. So it's more of a question on like I'm in that region, and so my day-to-day is more interacting with that versus kind of going out. But no, you gave a good answer nonetheless, but I just wanted to clarify that.
Well, we were very much focused on these trade linkages, right? So at the PIF, at that level, we were looking at a lot of G2G, government-to-government relationships. We were looking at, the big countries, US, China, India, Brazil. So I think it was very similar, very much an outward focus. I hope that explains it.
What have you found? You don't have to name a specific country, and we can skip this question if need be, but I'd be very curious to learn what you have found as kind of like the things that countries have done well versus not as well. And the reason I ask that question is I think that it's particularly in economics, it's really good to look at projects that have worked well in the past to be able to get a better thought of what could work well in the future. So of those countries that you work with, do you have any particular projects or things that they did really well or not as well that you think that we can learn from in the future to lead to more economic growth and less poverty and the other goals of the World Bank in the future?
Okay, yeah. So I think let's try and boil it down to what creates economic value. It's entrepreneurs. Entrepreneurs are people who take a risk, and that's where all of the value is created. So all the Magnificent Seven, these are trillion-dollar companies. They all started in a garage, right? If you think about, Apple, Steve Jobs, Steve Wozniak in the garage tinkering away. Now it's worth trillions. Meta, Facebook was started by a Harvard dropout on his own, basically. You think of all of them, Microsoft, a bunch of guys just, in the basement somewhere. They all went from zero to trillions of dollars. And that's how you create economic value. That's how you create jobs. That's how you move away from poverty. So it's not a particular project per se. It's putting in place the ecosystem that allows entrepreneurs to have those opportunities. And no country does it better than the US. So in terms of the regulations, simple regulations around business, access to finance, the venture capitalist system they have in America and Silicon Valley, the angel investor networks, the bank lending that you can do, the depth of the capital markets, all of those things allow America not just to develop their own entrepreneurs, but to attract all the different entrepreneurs from around the world. So, Elon Musk is probably the best example of an import, but many of Sundar Pichai and many of the others of tech titans have come from overseas as well. So the more you can do that, the more successful your economy is going to be. Now, the problem in a lot of MENA countries is they don't want to leave that to entrepreneurs. Either they want to control by the state, and many countries have fantastic state control over state-owned enterprises, the leading parts of industry. Or what you want to do is have the private sector control it, but not allow entrepreneurs to challenge them. So if you're the private sector in X country and the private sector is basically 10 big families, they're doing great, the last thing you want is entrepreneurship. They're going to just challenge what you're doing, and they're going to disrupt your cozy monopolies. So when you look at the policies that these countries have, a lot of them don't make it easy to start a new business, don't make it easy to register, don't make it easy to have contract enforcement. It's not easy to list on the stock exchange, it's not easy to get a loan from a bank, etc. So I think rather than one particular great project, it's the countries that have built those successful ecosystems to support entrepreneurship that have prospered the most.
You know, when I asked you that question, I kind of presumed that you would give an answer with a country in your particular region. And the reason I thought that is I often look at the Middle East as a low tax environment. You see a lot of people, and I'll come back to this later on, but a lot of people, particularly from the UK, are leaving towards the Middle East. But I never knew about the regulation or the difficulties to, actually take your business to the next level. And the US is obviously the epicenter of the world for business in that particular point of view. But I guess it's really interesting to learn that it does make sense, because it's not just the trend that 10 or 12 families own all these big companies, but actually it's the specific way those countries are set up. And despite that having a lot of benefits, because some people can control things and it allows people from the top to have their own view on things, it restricts the ability for people at the bottom who are really smart, very entrepreneurial, who have the work and the drive and who can think of new ideas to go about inventing something new. So you can only, China have this problem as well, where a lot of the businesses are kind of built at the top, but it's not as accessible to build it from the bottom up. Whereas in the US, it's like, we don't care who you are, what you look like, build the best business, rise to the top. Okay, this is the business we're going to use, drives the economy forward, drives even further innovation. And so it's very fascinating to kind of hear the links between policy and regime rules, and many countries have done extraordinarily well doing that, but also to say, if you want new things, you're going to have to get new ideas from new people.
Yeah. I mean, within the region, Harvey, you're right. A lot of people from UK are going out to Dubai and UAE. UAE is number one in the region in terms of ease of doing business, and number one in terms of streamlining the business environment. And that's what has driven their growth. And part of the reason behind that is that Dubai has almost no oil now. They were forced to really fast track all of their investment schemes to attract foreigners. They knew from the very beginning they were not going to be able to rely on oil for the rest of their lives. I think, don't quote me on this, but I think oil revenues are less than 5% of the revenues in Dubai. Abu Dhabi still has plenty of oil, and sometimes Dubai gets stuck overreaching and has to go to Big Brother and ask for a bailout. But for the most part, it's because they have created this excellent business environment. And why they've got a lot of people from the UK is because they decided very early on to adopt UK common law as a business law in UAE. So that's naturally attracted a lot of UK lawyers and bankers, etc. And I think that provides some stability and comfort to investors from around the world, who also believe that the UK has a great regulatory framework, and one that's familiar to a lot of people around the world.
What do you think the UK can learn from the Middle East?
Okay, good question. So I think one of the things that Middle East does very well is to provide a kind of safe and secure environment in which there's a lot of accountability for personal behavior. And I think that comes at a price, it comes at a cost, but I think it's a cost worth bearing. So, on my last trips to the UK, and this is also true in the US in some parts, say San Francisco, there's quite a lot of rampant crime, street crime. People say you can't wear a watch out in London anymore, expensive watch, you'll get mugged, and there's a lot of muggings and street crime. So I'm someone who's worked in 80 different countries. I've worked in some hotspots in the Niger Delta, in Kabul, in plenty of fragile environments. The only place I was ever attacked was in London, in Islington. And so I think there is something to be said for improving security. The UK, for some reason, they have a lot of cameras, and there's quite a lot of surveillance. But it doesn't seem to deter criminals because they don't seem to have very strict enforcement. And they don't really seem to have high penalties for some of these street crimes. And that's allowed a lot of proliferation of gangs and drugs, etc., which is not tolerated to any extent in the Middle East. I think that's one of the things that make it also a great environment for families. The safety and security. You can leave your bag anywhere and nobody's going to touch it, and nobody's going to break into your car, etc. I think that's something that I've really enjoyed, in my time in the GC.
From my perspective, and for those that are listening, I'm not a world-leading economist, so take what I say with a pinch of salt. But I definitely do think that there is a line. I don't think it's a fine line. I think there is space between, what is being done in the Middle East, and even if you look at what Trump's done in Washington versus the UK, I think there's a lot of room in between that. And the reason I say that is, I wouldn't say I wasn't attacked, but I got my phone stolen in, I think September 2022. 5-day period. I was walking in the street. This was around Covent Garden, and just walking with my friend, and just see this lady get shoved by a guy on a bike, just nabs her phone, cycles off. And then a couple of days later, similar thing. I'm out at night with my friend. You see a lady just gets shoved, thrown against a wall. Someone nabs the phone. We were debating, do we stop this guy or not, and decided, my life's worth a bit more than trying to get a phone. So just let the guy go past. And then a couple of days later, it was maybe 6 in the evening. It was this was in the summer. This was June or something like that. So it was quite bright outside. And I was on this street and I was FaceTiming my dad and my AirPods in. And this bike just came up next to me and stole my phone out of my hand in these kind of pimped up bikes that are way faster than, anything you can chase. And after that, I work out my way back to where I was staying, 40 minutes away. And I call the police. I'm like, hey, my phone's just been stolen, is there anything that can be done? And they're like, oh, I'm really sorry. So 2 police officers come to where I was staying, and I'm like, hey, I can see where this person is. I've got my data on, I've got Find My iPhone on, it's here. It's literally 5 minutes from where I got my phone stolen. And they're like, I'm really sorry, son, but there's nothing we can do about it. Basically, what these criminals do is they go into these apartment buildings, and what happens is, let's say the phone is on the 11th floor, they can't tell which apartment it's in. So there's a court law that basically is we don't want, I guess rightfully so, you don't want innocent people getting their doors barged down. But basically they could tell where my phone was, but couldn't take it. But what the criminals have worked out, they're like, okay, we just go to these apartment buildings where innocent people are, and do these operations. And, it comes a point, right, when you've got 100 phones on Find My iPhone in one building that, you've got to stop it. But that's kind of something from my own personal experience where, if they crack down on that a little bit more, if Apple maybe had a thing you could tell the exact apartment, or even if you have 10, maybe if you have 100 phones, in a building at one point in time, maybe something has to be done. And the other thing I would just add to that, before you respond, that I think is quite difficult is something that I've learned in the UK, where you've got that problem, immigration, the economy, etc. The government's only really, from a top-down level with the news and stuff, is only really focused on one major issue at a time. So now, immigration is becoming a bigger issue. So stuff like the phones kind of gets thrown to the side. So it's quite hard in a democracy to go about, getting things done when the public opinion changes from day to day. And so therefore you need public opinion to get the actual change enacted. So I don't know if you had any response to either of those things I mentioned.
Yeah, no, I'm sorry to hear about your phone, because nowadays our lives are in our phones, right? So I don't know how you manage without one. I think the way they deal with these things in the GCC is that everything is linked to your ID number or your residency number. So to have a phone, you need to have a residency. To have a bank account, you need to have a residency. Your car is also linked to your residency. Everything is linked to your residency. So it's not really very possible to steal somebody else's phone and use it, or car or anything else. So when you take your car to get service, you need to bring your ID. They check that this is actually your car, or you have a letter from the car owner saying that it's given permission to get a service, etc., etc. So all of those things are very, very tightly controlled. And I think that's also using those systems, electronic data systems, is something that really helps them to crack down on it. The other thing is that, if you do commit a crime in any of these countries and you're from an expat community, you can be deported immediately. And I think a lot of people are grateful to have the opportunity to be in those countries. I think UK could learn a lot from that. US, I think, is trying to do that. to a large extent. If you listen to what Donald Trump is talking about, it's not really about immigration, it's about fighting crime, according to him. And I think they've been trying to track down some of those with criminal records who are illegally in the States and deporting them back to their home countries. Obviously a very controversial topic. It's probably a topic that I won't comment on anymore. But yeah, we're feeling it here in DC.
I want to, just in the interest of time, not really short answers, but short to answer questions. I'm going to go just because I want to kind of cover quite a lot of ground and get some, at least a surface level opinion on it. How has I guess you mentioned more people are going into the UAE, but how has the 2030 vision in Saudi Arabia, how has that gone about attracting more people into the country? Are they on track for this goal? Do you think it's working well?
Short answers, but you ask big questions.
No,
So
they're all big questions, but yeah, I just want to...
Yeah, so I think Vision 2030 has managed to attract the world's attention. You know, things like NEOM have gone viral. The idea of the Saudi World Cup also attracted attention. Expo 2030, all of these big international things. Ronaldo going there, the boxing matches, you know, the tennis matches, Sina, etc. So these have all attracted a lot of attention and a lot of people pouring in because they need the expertise, engineers, the architects, planners, financiers, etc., etc. So yes, I believe 1 million expats came to Saudi Arabia during 2024. So yes, it's attracting a lot of people. And as you said earlier, they're coming for the zero tax, higher salaries, and comfortable standard of living. Is it going to achieve its objectives? Well, it's not going to achieve everything by 2030. And I think now we're seeing a pullback from some of the more ambitious targets. We're seeing a reprioritization. NEOM line is not going to be built by 2030. Now we're seeing a more realistic view of it. It's going to be multi-generational, maybe even a 100-year project, but a very long-term project that will start in modules and will be built out on a more sustainable basis. So I think that's the short answer.
How has the role of the region changed with the Israel-Palestine war and the stability and then the kind of change, the oscillation between stability and instability in the region?
Okay. So this is still obviously work in progress. The ceasefire is still holding for now. There's a lot of different plans on the table. There's the Egyptian plan, there's the US-Israeli plan, there's lots of other plans. So we don't know how it's going to pan out. But the ceasefire has created at least a little bit of stability for now. At least the attacks have stopped. The death toll has stopped, which is great in terms of the start. Now, there are a lot of countries in the region that are pushing for greater stability, but pushing also to resolve this problem that has been, outstanding since 1948, at least, if not earlier. And I think people see this as an opportunity. It's been a very challenging time, and really so many people have lost their lives. This is a chance to really put that behind us all and find a permanent solution to the Palestinian issues. And I think that's why that will definitely be on the table, definitely be discussed today with His Highness MES and President Trump. But I think there's still a lot of sticking points to come. It will take a long time. We've been at it for almost 80 years. It's not going to be resolved in a day or two. It will take a lot of discussions and negotiations. And also, there's still this big issue about who's going to finance the reconstruction. Nobody wants to finance the reconstruction until Hamas have given up their arms, because nobody wants to build something that's going to be destroyed again in a few years' time. I think Hamas is obviously not one to give up their arms, since the raison d'etre is the armed struggle against occupation. So we have a bit of a chicken and egg, and it will take a lot of goodwill from the international community, from Arab countries, but also from Europeans and the US, of course, and the Israeli side, to find a permanent solution to it. But for now, I think that the stability is welcomed by all sides.
How do the countries that you look at manage the balance between attracting foreign direct investment and preserving local control over strategic assets?
Okay, so some countries have a negative list. They say foreigners can come, but not in these sectors. Maybe not in defense, maybe not in energy. Whatever the country says is a strategic or sensitive sector. So that's an easy way of doing it. Other countries require a local partner. So many countries in the region have until recently required 51% ownership, local ownership on many of these topics. So the only way for foreigners to come in was to partner with a local agent or contractor. And that's another way of maintaining control. Others have said you can come in, but you can't own property. Property is only for nationals. And that's another way. All of the ways of, and it's a balance, right? So the more freedom you can give to the investor, the more confidence they'll have, the more investment you'll see. And countries that really need the investment have provided the freest arrangements. Countries that are super wealthy, that don't really need the investment, have had all of the restrictions and regulations just to stop it coming in, basically. That's the spectrum.
Are you seeing you mentioned sports such as boxing, tennis, etc. in the region. Are you seeing that there's kind of like similar levels of investment in the region versus the US and the UK? Are people sort of starting to invest in the similar things, or have you found that there's kind of like a disparity in what people are investing in your region versus the wider world?
On the sports front in particular?
No, just like generally. But like, for example, in the Middle East, they might have more of a focus of investing in sports. Like they're building up like the Riyadh boxing and the tennis, as you said, and the US already has that infrastructure. So it's more of a question of like, if you're noticing that there might be like they're both investing in AI, or Saudis are investing more in sports and things like that in the US and in AI. I'm kind of interested to see if they're kind of like going on similar planes or kind of diverging in terms of where their investment focus is.
Okay. Yeah. So I mean, I think on the investment side, they follow national priorities. Saudi and to a lesser extent UAE and Qatar and Oman, they're all interested in tourism. They are all interested in sports because they all have very young populations. 70% of the population under the age of 30. These are young people. They're into sports, etc. AI is probably the one thing that matches between Saudi and Europe and US. And so UAE and Saudi and to a lesser extent Qatar are all trying to develop the AI ecosystems and invest at all stages of the tech stack. They all have cheap energy. Saudi has plenty of free land as well. So they all seem to be potential for data centers, etc., and hosting facilities in those countries. Yeah, the US is more of a mature market. They've taken pretty big hits from some of the tariff barriers. Also, fewer tourists coming, so that's hit the tourism sector, the hotel sector, and all of the ancillary subsectors. And I think there is a lobby pushing for get some of those restrictions removed and treating some of the foreign guests a little bit better. I mean, I think it only takes a couple of German tourists to end up in El Salvador for Germans to stop coming or Canadians to stop coming when they hear that Trump wants to invade Canada. So I think some of those things have started to be rolled back, right, on the tariff front and on other areas. Yeah, so I think it depends where you stand, depends on where you sit, and these countries will invest their resources where they see their national priorities.
With regard to investment in manufacturing, AI, space, all of the diversification of these economies away from oil. I mean, you mentioned the UAE has largely gone off oil. What do you think are the biggest industries that they're betting on, which will provide the most returns in the future? Like, what do you think will be their winners in the region?
Yeah, so I think all of these countries are investing quite a lot on the energy transition. So they're investing a lot on green energy, green hydrogen, carbon capture and storage, all of these areas. They obviously receive a lot of sunlight. They're very hot places, and also onshore and offshore wind are big issues. They're investing a lot on desalination as well, because that's pretty much all of them get all of their water from desalination. They're investing in innovation and high tech, biotech, agri-tech, all of those areas, because they are high-income countries, so they don't really have a large, cheap labor force of their own people, so they can import cheaper labor from other regions. But they want to produce high-quality, high-paid jobs for their youngsters, who are now very well educated. They're graduating at very high levels. Many of them are studying abroad, coming home. have a lot of potential. And so I think all of those areas are super important for them. I think in terms of manufacturing, Saudi's more interested perhaps than the others because they've got a bigger population, a bigger market. They can produce for the internal market. So Saudi's made a big push to get an automotive sector up and running, bring in some battery makers, tire makers, make their own electric vehicles. I think they're probably the ones who are pushing most on that. Saudi also has a lot of potential in mining. So there's somewhere between $1 and $2 trillion worth of underground assets, not including the oil. So they've got gold, uranium. They may have a lot of rare earth minerals as well. So they're investing more and more on exploration. And there's large parts of the country, they call it the empty quarter, which is untouched, which has a lot of potential. Also, offshore reserves have also a lot of potential. So that seems to be the areas that they're focusing on.
We spoke earlier in the podcast that it's only those in the ruling classes or families that have the big decisions. But I'm sure that people in those families still have advisors, which, tell them to invest in all of the things that you just mentioned. I know that your role is to still interact with these countries in some capacity, but if you were the direct advisor to some of the leaders in these countries as they continue to move out of an oil economy into other things, you've mentioned rare earths and everything there, where would you recommend that they invest their money to get the best returns for the future? So a difference between before, where they're doing it and what would be the best based on their decisions versus with the experience that you've had. Do you think there's somewhere that they're not investing enough or can invest more, or that will help them into the future?
Okay, good question. So as I'm not an expert in investment strategy, but what I would say is, it's high risk, high reward, right? So the high risk areas are new technologies, proven technologies maybe, but this is where the big rewards are. And I think there's a lot of potential, for instance, in gas flaring. So if you ever go to any oil producing country, you'll see these massive gas flares. In Nigeria, they used to just, make the Niger Delta bright as daylight, even at night. You can go in Kuwait, you pass the Ahmadi oil well, you're a kilometer away from the gas flare, and when it flares up, you can feel the heat from a kilometer away. So this is basically that just money is being burned away, right? So these are fantastic resources. If you can figure out the technology, they're doing a lot of research and development on this area. It's not only going to be great for your country, but you will be able to export that to all of the other oil producing countries around the world, from Venezuela to Nigeria to Iran, Iraq, wherever. And I think the same goes for issues like methane leakage, carbon capture and storage, all of these technologies. If you can develop them, you will have unlimited market going away in the future. One of the issues I think has tremendous potential is solid waste management. So now I'm seeing a lot more initiatives about people who have a solid waste to energy plant that can take simply rubbish basically and turn it into diesel fuel, turn it into methane, turn it into whatever, with zero emissions. And some of these plants are so small that they can fit in a container and can manage 70, 80 tons per day. So some of these projects will be game changers in the future. And, for those who have a little bit more risk appetite, who are willing to take a bet, I think there'll be fantastic fortunes to be made in those areas.
Another important topic that you spoke about was youth unemployment, and people are becoming more educated, as Saudi in particular, but not just Saudi, we can expand to the wider region, but Saudi in particular, as they progress towards their Vision 2030, more jobs will be created. But yeah, going out to all of those countries. Similarly, you're giving advice directly to the people at the top. What do you think needs to be done to reduce youth unemployment?
So, great. Youth unemployment is part of unemployment. The more jobs we can create, the more youngsters will also get jobs. In one area, a couple of areas, youth are different to more seasoned employees. Number one, they have less experience. Number two, they have less networks. And probably less information on the job search. So if you can tackle those three things, you can help young people. The other thing is that many of the universities in the region are very old school and not necessarily, even in richest countries, they don't necessarily prepare the individuals for a job in the private sector. So these have traditionally been very bureaucratic countries with large public sectors, amount of government workers. And so the education system has been focused on turning out those reliable bureaucrats rather than turning out entrepreneurs or people who have an entrepreneurial spirit and willing to work in the private sector. So for those, I think you can have 6-month courses for soft skills to help people, either those who want to start their own business or those who want to work in the private sector, give them the tools that they will need to be effective in the private sector. That may be learning better English, it may be spreadsheets, it may be presentations, it may be negotiation skills. I think packaging those and providing that kind of vocational training for recent graduates can also help.
We saw a huge deal occur recently with the acquisition of EA Sports. Could you add on a little bit about what you thought about that deal, whether you think it's going to be a continued trend to these big companies, particularly in the US, being acquired by countries in the Middle East?
That was an exciting deal. And I think it's probably a portent of things to come. I think, one of the things that was happening in Saudi was that many of these things were being rented rather than owned. So, when you've been renting a house for a long time, you want to own the house, become a homeowner after a while. I think that's what we've seen also in the sports arena. So many of these big sporting events, Saudis don't own, but they rented them as a demonstration, see what it was like. And now they're moving to more ownership. So we used to have the esports tournament, which is super successful in Saudi, but we didn't own the franchises, right? Like EA Sports and others. Gaming is a huge deal in Saudi Arabia, as it is in most of the MENAP region. I think something like 60% of the country are gamers, and a huge percentage of the young people, including His Royal Highness the Crown Prince. He's a big time gamer himself. So I think it matches the culture, right? This is what young people are into. Now, the idea being, I think if we can take those franchises and tweak them so that they maybe even better match the Middle Eastern themes, to have, maybe 1001 Arabian Nights, or, content that is geared to an Arabian audience, then we can take it to the next level. But also just generally owning and developing games, I think is a big idea for the future generations. So that's kind of the thinking behind that acquisition. I think we've had a lot of bigger deals that didn't get much publicity, right? So we're seeing increasing amounts of, we have seen for a long time, I think, for the last maybe 20 years, ever since the oil price was high, we've seen countries in the Middle East buy up assets, real estate assets, hotels, infrastructure investments. So I don't think that's particularly new, but I think we're going to see more and more of it as they diversify their sovereign wealth funds.
I think something that a lot of people focus on, and they've focused on it for years, right? I mean, we go to school, we go to university, we get jobs in order to deliver shareholder value and the values of a company and the values of government or a region. But I feel a problem not just in those that are unemployed or those that have low income jobs, but even those that have high income jobs, is that a lot of people aren't educated on their personal finances. And you could be someone that's incredibly wealthy, incredibly rich, like they're getting a lot of cash, but they're not necessarily generating wealth through ownership, as you kind of talked about what Saudi Arabia are doing there. If we both agree that we are in sort of an AI bubble and that there will be some form of pullback, hopefully it won't be as bad as the 2008 financial crisis, but as we know, markets go up and markets go down. We haven't yet hit a point where anything's gone really bad. What advice would you give individuals around the world to best prepare themselves so that if or when a market pullback does occur, that people are best prepared for it or know what to expect?
Okay, so like last time, I think I'm not a personal finance expert, but I'll give you my 2 cents, and this is not World Bank advice or anything else. It's just Ismail's advice. So I do believe that our valuations are stretched, especially for AI companies, but also generally for the whole market. There's something called the Buffett indicator, and Warren Buffett says when the stock market capitalization is greater than the GDP of the country, you have a problem. And I think every time it's been 150% of GDP, you've had some kind of big event. And now I think it's closer to 250% of GDP. And you look at some of the PE ratios, astronomical, twice what they should be in a market that's in equilibrium. We are going to see a pullback. Now, the question is, how much more run-up are we going to see? I believe that we've seen the peak, at least for now. And, we've seen quite big declines this week and last week from the peak of, I think it was 47,000 or 48,000 on the Dow. So I do believe that we're going to close the year lower than this level. And I do believe that we will see a pullback of at least 30% in the coming 18 months. That's my personal predictions based on my years of following the markets. The dot-com bubble was followed by over a decade before the Nasdaq recovered. So if you're young enough, you can stay in the market and ride it out. If you're old like me and you're facing retirement in a period that's less than 10 years, then I think it's time to take some profits, move to a more defensive strategy, put some bonds in your portfolio, put some treasury-linked index bonds, corporate bonds, and maybe move out of some of the more speculative investments. Gold is also at an all-time high. I think, the gold price doesn't bear any reality to demand for gold. It's all about speculation. So again, I think we're going to see a pullback from these current figures as well. That's personally also what I'm doing. So I'm putting my money where my mouth is. This month, I moved all of my assets out of the market and into much more defensive positions.
I think it's a very important question to ask because we're kind of in this weird limbo stage. And I since we spoke, started to do these like weekly markets podcasts where I kind of speak to hedge fund managers on what's going on in public markets. And in preparation for a podcast a couple of weeks ago, I found 4 or 5 interviews with some of the great investors of our time. And some were saying, about half were saying that, let's say 5, one of them was saying in the green, keep going. 2 of them were saying that we're in like a late growth cycle. So like it will keep going up, don't know when it will end. And the other 2 were saying like, it's a bubble, it's got to stop. And something that's quite weird right now is that if a lot of people are in agreement that at some point in time there will be a pullback from these insane prices, we're in this weird stage where it hasn't happened yet. And so there is an ability to kind of prepare for it in a sense. And so I thought it was quite important to ask that question because in a couple of months' time or however long it is until something like this happens, again, this is not investment advice. I think it's important to have had that perspective beforehand and to have had the wisdom and the insights of whether it's speaking to me or Ismail or whoever it may be, getting advice from lots of different people and that informing your strategy before it happens. That being said, is there a question that I haven't asked you this podcast or in your own life that you're not often asked enough that you'd want to talk more about?
Well, let me just come back to you on your points there, because I think they're very interesting, right? So every time we have a bubble, there are people who believe that the bubble will not burst, right? Every time. There have to be optimists who drive up the markets. And every time I hear, this time it's different, right? So at the time of the dot-com bubble, there was a picture on the front of The Economist, and this is more than 20 years ago. I remember it very vividly. The American economy embodied in Captain America, and he's ripping a rule book the size of a telephone directory in half. This time it's different. But it wasn't different. And again, in the 2008 financial crisis, when markets get out of sync with reality, there will be a pullback. So we are out of sync with reality. There's no justification for these valuations. There will be a pullback. The question is when and how much. So anybody who tells you the market's going to go up forever, it's not true. And I think there are a lot of people with vested interests in the markets. So when you talk to hedge fund managers, etc., they will have all sorts of incentives to say one thing or another. I'm saying this as me personally. I don't have a skin in the game. I'm not representing any kind of hedge fund, etc., etc. What we see in the absolute fundamentals in the American economy and in Eurozone are very, very frightening. So, I mean, we've passed 100% of GDP in terms of the national debt, $38 trillion in the US. It's more than $100,000 per person. You can't continue to sustain debt like that forever. The debt markets will wake up. People will no longer want to buy American debt. Certainly the Chinese are probably not going to try and bail out the Americans. And they've been some of the biggest bondholders, Japanese also, Koreans, etc. So I think there will be a reckoning. And what's keeping the markets afloat right now is the massive deficit spending in the US and other countries. Yeah, I think those are the reasons I give. It's not just about the markets, it's about the fundamentals as well. And I think if you have a broader picture of the economy and you've been through a few cycles like this, you realize that we're in scary territory, right? You know the cartoon where Wile E. Coyote runs off the edge of the cliff and then you see his legs are running in the front and then he drops? That's where we are. We're at the part where the legs are running in the air.
And with reference to the question, in terms of, is there a question I haven't asked you?
No, I mean, I think you've covered a lot of ground, Harvey. It's always great to talk to you.
Well, I'll go into my final question. I think I probably asked you this in the spring, but what is one thing that you would want a listener to take away from this episode?
One thing that I would like a listener to take away from this episode is the absolute importance of entrepreneurs to our society. Entrepreneurs are the lifeblood of our economy. They are people who take risks with their own time, risks with their own resources. There's no guarantee that they will fail. They are the heroes of any economy. And the more that we can de-risk that process, the more support we can give them, the more empowering the regulations can be, the better off that we're all going to be. Entrepreneurs are the ones who create value. They're the ones who pay the taxes. They're the ones who create jobs. They're the ones who give meaning for a lot of our day-to-day living. So that's, I think, my takeaway for today.
Well, thank you very much for coming on Personable again today. When I was originally researching this podcast, I kind of had some broad ideas of where we could take it, but I feel like every topic we hit far exceeded my expectations. I feel like I learned a ton, not only about my own personal finances, but also policy differences between the UK and the Middle East in terms of not only where the regions like Saudi are going to succeed in terms of what they're currently doing, but also where countries in that region can improve if taking another direction. They don't need to put all their eggs in one basket. I find it fascinating to learn about youth unemployment, the rise in education in the region, but also a need to get people into the private sector and not just the public sector, and on and on and on. I learned a lot. I really appreciate you coming on and sharing your perspectives today. I'm sure we'll get you on again in the future. So thank you so much for coming on today.
Thanks very much, Harvey. I very much enjoyed the discussion. So please do have me on in a year's time. We replay all of these predictions and we'll see if I was correct or not. Thank you very much.
I look forward to it, but the sad thing is that if you're right, it won't have good surroundings. So people won't want to hear "I told you so," but perhaps it's inevitable.
Well, depends if they've taken action or not.
This was the sign, so I guess share this with all your friends and family.
Thanks a lot.